The storm had been going for 38 hours straight. Wind out of the north, gusts hitting 60 miles per hour, temperatures dropping past minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit and still falling. Snow so thick and so fast that the county road had vanished completely by the second night, swallowed whole, like it had never been there at all. By dawn of the third day, every household on that stretch of rural Montana had gone cold. Every single one. Pipes burst. Stoves went out. Families huddled under every blanket they owned and still shivered. 2 neighbors had to be pulled out by sled, their homes no longer survivable. The kind of winter that people in that county would still be talking about 40 years later, not as a hardship but as a reckoning. And yet, from across a snow-buried field, through the white-out darkness, there was a faint amber glow coming from inside an old wooden barn. Not a fire. Not an emergency lantern left swinging in the wind. Something steadier than that. Something deliberate. A neighbor who spotted it later said he thought he was imagining things at first. A barn with a light on, in the middle of the worst blizzard in a generation. He assumed whoever was in there was in trouble. He was wrong. What no one in that community had ever paid much attention to, the strange iron structure she had built inside that barn years earlier, turned out to be the only reason she survived that winter without a single night of dangerous cold. They had laughed when she built it, said it was a waste of surplus war metal, said a woman alone had no business welding curved steel inside a drafty old barn, heating it with a stove that looked too small to matter. They stopped laughing on the morning of the 4th day when they came knocking. This is the story of what she built, why it worked, and what a curved steel shell inside an old wooden barn understood about heat, mass, and survival that almost no one else on that road had figured out. If you've ever wondered whether old-fashioned ingenuity could still beat modern construction in a real emergency, stay with this one. And if you're watching from somewhere cold right now, drop a comment below and tell us where you're from. Hit subscribe if you're new. We cover stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Her name was Edna Calloway, and she had lived alone on that 40-acre parcel outside of Shelby, Montana since 1951, the year her husband passed from a heart condition that the nearest hospital, 90 miles away, couldn't do much about in time. She was not the kind of woman people worried about. She had weathered hard seasons before. She kept a small herd of cattle, a root cellar stocked before the first frost every October, and a wood pile that her neighbors privately admitted was always better organized than their own. She was methodical, quiet, and she had a habit of solving problems that no one else had thought to solve yet. The Quonset hut had come to her almost by accident. In the years following World War II, surplus military equipment flooded rural America. G-parts, canvas tents, and thousands upon thousands of prefabricated steel arch structures that the Army had used to store equipment, house troops, and build instant field hospitals across the Pacific Theater. By the late 1940s, you could buy a disassembled Quonset hut, corrugated steel panels, curved ribs, hardware included, for next to nothing at government surplus auctions. Farmers across the northern plains snapped them up for grain storage and equipment sheds. Edna bought one in the fall of 1953. It cost her less than the price of a decent milk cow. Most people who purchased surplus Quonset units set them up as standalone structures. Drop the foundation bolts into a concrete pad, assemble the arched ribs, bolt on the corrugated steel panels, and you had a storage building in a weekend. Cheap, functional, no surprises. Edna did something different. She set hers up inside the barn, not adjacent to the barn, not leaning against the barn's exterior wall. Inside, within the existing wooden structure, positioned toward the center of the space, surrounded on all sides by the barn's own walls, its hayloft above, its old pine framing absorbing the wind from every direction before it ever reached the steel shell of Quonset. The gap between the outer barn wall and the curved steel surface of the Quonset averaged about 4 feet on either side, and roughly 6 feet at the peak of the arch where the Quonset's crown nearly touched the hayloft floor. That space was not wasted. It was filled, naturally, seasonally, with stored hay, hanging tools, the slow body heat of 4 cattle in their stalls at the barn's far end, and most critically, with dead air. Trapped, still unmoving air. She installed a small cast-iron box stove inside the Quonset. A single flue pipe ran up through a pre-cut hole in the corrugated steel, continued upward through a sealed metal collar at the hayloft floor, and exited through the barn roof. The hole penetration was tight, insulated with mineral wool she had salvaged from an old icehouse demolition, and sealed against sparks with a steel plate. The interior of the Quonset measured roughly 22 feet long and 16 feet wide at the base, with a ceiling height of about 10 feet at the crown of the arch. It was her bedroom, her kitchen, her sitting room, and her workshop, all in one curved steel shell inside a wooden barn on a frozen Montana plain. The neighbors who saw it for the first time did not know what to make of it. One man, whose own home had a respectable stone fireplace and solid pine walls, told local oral accounts that he walked through the barn, looked at the setup, shook his head, and said, with no particular cruelty, just genuine confusion, "Edna, you're sleeping inside a tin can inside a shed." She didn't argue. She offered him coffee and changed the subject. The winter of 1957 would settle the argument for her. To understand why Edna's choice of structure mattered, you have to understand what the Quonset hut actually was, and why its design had survived some of the most brutal environments on Earth before it ever arrived on her Montana property. The Quonset hut was developed in 1941 by the United States Navy, engineered at the Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island, which is where the name came from. The design brief was unforgiving. Build a structure that could be shipped in pieces, assembled by non-specialists in under a day, capable of surviving extreme weather, and cheap enough to produce by the tens of thousands. The engineers solved that brief with a geometry that had been understood by builders for centuries. The arch. A semicircular arch distributes load differently than a flat wall. When wind pushes against a flat vertical surface, all that force hits at perpendicular angles. Maximum resistance, maximum stress at the corners and joints. When wind pushes against a curved surface, the force is deflected. It slides along the contour of the arch, dispersed across the entire structure rather than concentrated at a single point. The same principle that makes an egg nearly impossible to crush with even pressure is what allowed a Quonset hut's thin corrugated steel, only about 1/8 of an inch thick, to withstand the kind of sustained lateral wind loads that would buckle or warp a flat-walled structure of similar material. But the arch did something else too, something less obvious, and something Edna understood instinctively even if she never had a formal name for it. Heat rises. Every homesteader, farmer, and frontier builder knew that. It's why a tall ceilinged room is hard to keep warm. The hot air climbs immediately and pools at the ceiling, far above the people who need it. A flat ceiling captures that heat at head height, which is efficient, but creates a sharp thermal boundary. Warm below, cold above, with significant heat escaping through any gap at the ceiling wall joint. A curved ceiling, specifically the smooth interior arc of a Quonset, behaves differently. Hot air rising from the stove reaches the crown of the arch, and, rather than pooling flat and stagnant, is gently redirected back down along the interior curve of the walls. It circulates. It moves in a slow, continuous convective loop. Warm air rising at the center, cooling slightly as it descends along the steel walls, then being pulled back toward the heat source at the floor to be rewarmed. The same volume of heat works harder, moves farther, and loses less to dead zones. Military engineers called this natural convective circulation. Frontier builders, if they called it anything at all, probably just said the place held heat well. The corrugated steel surface itself contributed in a way that surprised many people who encountered it. Steel has low thermal mass. It heats up quickly and cools down quickly. On its own, that would make it a poor material for heat retention. But the corrugations, those ridged waves running along the surface, increase the actual surface area of the interior wall by roughly 30 to 40% compared to a flat sheet of the same dimensions. More surface area meant more material interacting with the warm interior air, creating a thin thermal buffer layer along the entire interior skin of the structure. It wasn't a massive effect. Steel was never going to match the heat-holding capacity of sandstone or dense clay. But combined with the convective loop of the arch, and combined, critically, with the outer wooden barn providing a wind buffer and a second thermal shell. The result was a layered heating system where each element compensated for the weaknesses of the others. The military had sent Quonset huts to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, to the frozen highlands of the Korean Peninsula, to windswept airstrips on the North Atlantic. In those postings, soldiers and airmen reported that a properly heated Quonset, even in extreme cold, was noticeably warmer and more stable in temperature than standard wooden barracks of the same floor area, assuming equivalent fuel use. Edna had never read those field reports. She had never consulted an engineer, but she had grown up on a homestead where her grandmother kept a smokehouse inside a larger outbuilding to protect the curing meat from temperature swings. She had watched, as a child, how the outer building didn't need to be warm. It just needed to be still. The stillness was what mattered. No wind pulling the heat away. No drafts cutting under the door. That instinct, shelter within shelter, was what she carried into that barn in 1953, bolt by bolt, panel by panel, alone on a Saturday afternoon while her neighbors were in town. Most people, when they think about insulation, think about what's directly between them and the cold. The wall of the house, the blanket on the bed, the coat on the back. One layer between warm and frozen. What Edna had built, without using the word insulation for most of it, was a system of successive layers, each one doing a specific job, each one reducing the amount of work the next layer had to do. The barn itself was the outermost layer, and it was doing far more thermal work than anyone looking at it from the road would have guessed. The barn was a large post and beam structure, probably built around 1910 based on local records describing the original homestead. The walls were double-planked pine, 2 layers of rough-sawn 1-inch boards, the inner layer running vertically, the outer layer running horizontally, with a gap of about 2 inches between them. That gap, packed in places with old straw and in other places with nothing but trapped air, functioned as an unintentional but effective insulating cavity. Old barns of that construction type, measured in comparable winter conditions, typically maintained an interior air temperature of between 15 and 25 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the exterior, not because of any active heating, but purely through mass, layering, and wind elimination. On a night when the outdoor temperature dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, the unheated barn interior was likely sitting somewhere between minus 5 and 0 degrees. Still brutally cold by any modern standard, but critically, profoundly different from the full force of an open-air blizzard. The difference was not just temperature. It was wind. Wind is the great accelerant of heat loss. A still air cold of minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit is dangerous. A wind-driven cold of minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit at 60 miles per hour reaches an effective wind chill somewhere around minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, a number that causes exposed skin to develop frostbite in under 5 minutes. And that strips heat from any structure through convective loss at a rate many times higher than still air conditions. The barn walls stopped the wind entirely. The moment you stepped through the barn door and closed it behind you, the roaring, punishing wind outside became a distant sound, a low moan through the rafters. Manageable. The air inside was still, and still cold air, even very cold still air, is something a thermal mass and a small fire can fight. Then came the second layer, the hay. Edna kept her Quonset positioned near the center of the barn floor, with stacked hay bales lining the walls between the Quonset steel flanks and the barn's inner walls. Hay is a remarkable natural insulator. Its structure, hollow plant fibers trapping millions of tiny pockets of air, gives it thermal resistance properties similar to fiberglass bats. A hay bale, approximately 18 inches thick at standard baling density, offers thermal resistance comparable to 3 to 4 inches of modern fiberglass insulation. Edna typically had between 2 and 4 bales deep along each side of the Quonset, stacked chest high. That hay didn't just sit there looking pastoral. It absorbed ambient heat from the barn interior slowly across the day. The body warmth of the cattle at the far end, the passive solar gain coming through the 2 south-facing barn windows on clear days, and released that stored warmth back into the barn air slowly through the night. It was thermal mass, low-grade, agricultural, accidental thermal mass, but thermal mass nonetheless. The cattle contributed more than most people would expect. For a head of cattle, even at rest, generate considerable metabolic heat. Each animal produces somewhere between 300 and 500 BTUs per hour simply by existing, breathing, digesting, staying alive. For animals, across a 12-hour overnight period, we're adding between 14,000 and 24,000 BTUs of slow, diffuse warmth into that barn's enclosed air space. Not enough to heat the barn to comfort, but more than enough to push the baseline temperature a few critical degrees above where it would have been without them. By the time the cold Montana night had penetrated the outer barn walls, crossed the hay-lined gap, and reached the curved steel shell of the Quonset, it had already been reduced, slowed, stripped of its wind component, moderated by thermal mass on three sides. The small cast-iron stove inside the Quonset didn't have to fight the full fury of a minus 22-degree blizzard. It had to fight something far more manageable, the slow, still cold of an enclosed space that had already been buffered twice. That distinction between fighting the raw outdoors and fighting an already moderated interior is the core of what made Edna's system work. And it is, perhaps surprisingly, the same principle that modern passive house architects pay tens of thousands of dollars in engineering fees to replicate with foam board, vapor barriers, and triple pane glass. She did it with wood, straw, cattle, and a surplus military hut. The physics didn't care where the knowledge came from. There's a particular kind of knowledge that doesn't come from books or engineering schools or county extension offices. It comes from watching, from paying attention to what works and what fails across many winters in a specific place, with specific materials, under specific pressures. Edna Callaway had that kind of knowledge. And almost every decision she made while building her Quonset setup, decisions that struck her neighbors as wasteful, eccentric, or simply wrong, turned out to be exactly right. The first thing people noticed and questioned was the stove. Edna had chosen a small cast-iron box stove for the interior of the Quonset. Not a parlor stove, not one of the large, heavy sheet metal heaters that many homesteaders favored for their immediate, aggressive heat output. Her stove was compact, roughly 18 inches wide, 24 inches long, and about 20 inches tall, with a firebox capacity of around 3/4 of a cubic foot. It weighed approximately 140 pounds. By the standards of the northern Montana winter, it looked undersized. Inadequate. The kind of stove you might use in a hunting shack for a weekend, not a primary dwelling through a January that could drop to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit without warning. A neighbor named Roy Dexter, according to local oral accounts from the Shelby area, stopped by during the assembly and told Edna flatly that the stove was too small, that she'd freeze, that she needed something with at least twice the firebox capacity if she was going to be serious about staying warm in a metal building. Edna thanked him for his opinion and went back to work. What Roy didn't understand, what most people accustomed to heating large, poorly insulated spaces didn't understand, was that stove sizing is not an absolute. It is a ratio. The right stove for a given space is not the biggest stove you can fit through the door. It is the stove whose output matches the actual heat loss rate of that specific space under the specific conditions you're designing for. Edna's Quonset interior had roughly 352 square feet of floor area and a volume of approximately 2,800 cubic feet, a smaller space than most single-room cabins on that road. But it sat inside a barn that had already eliminated wind-driven convective heat loss from the equation entirely. The effective thermal load on that small stove was not a Montana blizzard. It was a buffered, still-air enclosure that had already been pre-moderated to somewhere around 0 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit by the time the cold reached the Quonset steel skin. A rough calculation, using the kind of figures a heating engineer would recognize as plausible, suggests that the actual heat loss rate of the Quonset interior under those buffer conditions was somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 BTUs per hour. The small cast-iron box stove, burning dry pine at a moderate rate, could produce between 8,000 and 12,000 BTUs per hour at its operating range. She wasn't running the stove at full draw. She was running it slow and steady, banking the coals, keeping the firebox ticking over rather than blazing. This was the second thing people misunderstood. She burned far less wood than her neighbors expected. Most frontier heating strategies in that region followed a simple logic. Burn hard, burn hot, keep the fire roaring. That approach works in a leaky structure with high air infiltration because you have to continuously overpower the heat loss. But in a well-buffered space with low infiltration, burning hard and hot is wasteful. You overshoot the target temperature, the excess heat escapes through whatever gaps exist, and you burn twice the wood for the same result. Edna's stove, in her buffered Quonset, consumed between 3 and 4 cords of split pine across a full Montana winter. Her neighbors with larger homes and open fireplaces were burning 6 to 9 cords for spaces that still ran cold. The third decision people questioned was the ventilation. Edna had installed a small adjustable vent, roughly 4 inches in diameter, low on the wall of the Quonset, near the floor on the side facing away from the stove. It was connected to a short metal duct that ran through the steel skin of the Quonset and terminated in the open barn air. The vent could be opened or closed from inside with a simple sliding plate. Why would you cut a hole in your insulated wall to let cold air in? It seemed like madness. But Edna understood something that modern building scientists now codify in ventilation standards. A completely sealed interior, especially one with a wood-burning stove consuming oxygen, will stratify. Oxygen depletes near the floor. Carbon monoxide builds. The air quality degrades in ways that are dangerous long before the temperature becomes a problem. Her low intake vent drew the densest, coldest air from the barn floor, air that had already been buffered by the barn itself, and introduced it at floor level, where the stove's natural convective circulation could pick it up immediately and drive it upward to mix with the warm layer near the arch crown. It was a controlled, minimal fresh air exchange that kept the interior breathable without punching a hole in the thermal performance of the system. She had worked all of this out by trial and error across 4 winters before the blizzard of 1957. She had made mistakes. She had been too cold some nights and too smoky others. She had adjusted the vent size, repositioned the stove twice, experimented with different wood species and burn rates. By the winter of 1957, the system had been refined into something that worked with quiet, reliable precision. Nobody had asked her how she'd gotten there. Nobody had thought to ask. The storm that reached Toole County on the evening of January 14th, 1957, did not announce itself gently. Weather forecasting in rural Montana in that era was a rough science. The county extension office ran a radio weather service, and farmers checked it every morning as a matter of habit. The forecast for that week had called for a cold front and possible snow. That description, delivered in the flat, measured voice of the radio announcer, translated in practice to something of an entirely different order. By 8 o'clock that evening, the wind had shifted hard from the northwest and began building to sustained speeds of 45 miles per hour, with gusts touching 60. The temperature, which had been sitting at a manageable 12 degrees Fahrenheit at midday, dropped through 0 by midnight and kept going. By 4 in the morning, the thermometer outside Edna's barn registered minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind had not slowed. The snow came horizontally. It did not fall so much as it was driven, scoured from the open plain and hurled at anything vertical with a force that left drifts against the windward walls of buildings up to 8 feet deep by morning. The county road disappeared under 2 feet of compacted snow before sunrise. No plow could have reached that stretch for days. Inside the farmhouses along that road, families were waking to find their situations deteriorating faster than they had anticipated. The problem was not, primarily, the cold itself. It was the combination of cold and wind acting together on structures that had been built to adequate standards for normal Montana winters, but not for this. Standard wood-frame farmhouses of that era, with single-pane windows, minimal wall insulation, an open hearth or simple cast-iron stoves, lose heat at a rate that scales with both the temperature differential between inside and outside and the wind-driven air infiltration pushing cold air through every gap, crack, and poorly fitted window frame. At minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit with 60-mile-per-hour wind, that infiltration rate can triple compared to still air conditions at the same temperature. Heat leaves a house not just through the walls, but through every unsealed joint, every draft, every keyhole. The stove has to work 3 times harder to maintain the same interior temperature, and that means burning through wood reserves at a rate that no family had stocked for, because no one had expected a storm this severe. Edna's nearest neighbor to the east, a family of 4 in a well-built 2-story farmhouse, found by the morning of the second day that their main floor had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit despite burning continuously through the night. Their upstairs bedrooms were worse. The wind had found a gap where the chimney penetrated the roof line and was pulling warm air directly out of the house at a rate no stove could compensate for. To the west, an older man living alone in a smaller homestead cabin had his water pipes freeze inside the wall by the first night. By the second morning, his interior temperature had dropped low enough that his cast-iron stove, which he'd been running at full draw for 16 hours, could no longer maintain a livable temperature against the heat loss. He packed what he could carry and walked to the nearest shelter he could reach. A family 2 parcels down lost their barn on the second night when a section of roof, loaded with wet, wind-packed snow, gave way under the weight. The cattle inside survived. The structure did not. And through all of it, through 38 hours of sustained assault that stripped every margin from every building on that stretch of land, Edna Calloway was inside her Quonset. She had prepared for this, though not specifically for this storm. She had a week's worth of split pine stacked inside the Quonset along the north wall. She had a 5-gallon water jug filled before the storm reached full strength, and a cast-iron pot for melting snow as a backup. She had canned goods, dried beans, cornmeal, coffee, and a kerosene lantern with 2 full reservoirs of fuel. She had wool blankets, a rope she could use to follow from the barn door to the house if she needed to cross the yard, and a cast-iron skillet that doubled as a hand warmer when set near, not on, the stovetop. She did not leave the barn for 3 days. She fed the cattle twice daily. She banked the stove before sleeping and woke to find it still drawing, still warm, the interior of the Quonset holding steady at a temperature she later described, in an account recorded by a county agricultural extension worker who visited the property the following spring, as about the same as a cool root cellar in October. Cold enough to see your breath near the floor. Warm enough to sleep without every blanket you own. Outside, the wind howled and the drifts climbed. Inside the barn, inside the steel arch, the system worked exactly as the physics said it would. On the morning of the second day, Edna used a small mercury thermometer, the kind used to check if milk had cooled enough for safe storage, to take a series of temperature readings inside the Quonset. She recorded them in a small notebook she kept for farm accounts. That notebook, referenced later by the county extension worker who documented her setup in 1958, gave a picture of thermal performance that was, by the standards of what was happening outside, remarkable. At floor level, near the intake vent, the interior temperature read 48 degrees Fahrenheit. At seated height, roughly 3 feet off the floor, it read 54 degrees. At standing height, near the crown of the arch, the thermometer registered 61 degrees. The stove had been burning at a slow, steady rate through the night, consuming approximately 1.5 split logs per hour, a rate that, across an 8-hour overnight burn, represented roughly 12 pounds of pine. Outside the barn, at the same time, Edna's exterior thermometer, mounted on the north face of the barn wall in accordance with standard meteorological practice, read -22 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was still at sustained 45 miles per hour. The differential between the exterior air and the warmest interior zone of the Quonset, the crown of the arch at standing height, was 83 degrees Fahrenheit. 83 degrees of separation between the inside and the outside, maintained by a small cast-iron stove burning at a modest rate in a corrugated steel shell inside an old wooden barn on an exposed Montana plain. To put that number in context, the neighbor's 2-story farmhouse to the east, a well-built structure with solid pine walls, a large stone fireplace, and a family burning wood continuously through the night, had an interior temperature on the main floor of 28 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of the second day. That house was losing the fight. Its interior to exterior differential, under continuous maximum fire, was 50 degrees. It was burning more wood, fighting harder, and achieving less. The reason was not the quality of the farmhouse. It was the fundamental difference in what each structure had to fight. The farmhouse was exposed directly to the full force of the blizzard. Wind-driven cold air infiltrated through every gap. The stove was fighting not just conduction, heat passing through the walls, but convection, cold air physically entering the building and displacing warm air. That convective loss cannot be easily compensated for with more fire, because the more you heat the air, the faster the pressure differential pulls it out and draws cold air in to replace it. The Quonset was fighting neither of those things at full intensity. The barn had already killed the wind. The hay in the dead air space had already slowed conduction to the Quonset's steel shell. The only thermal battle the stove inside the Quonset was fighting was against the slow, still, already buffered cold of the barn interior, a manageable opponent that a modest fire could handle without strain. This is the core principle that Edna's setup demonstrated without anyone formally studying it. In cold climate thermal management, the quality of what you are fighting matters as much as the intensity of what you are fighting with. Reducing the severity of the thermal challenge, through layering, through wind elimination, through dead air space, is not less effective than increasing the power of the heat source. In many conditions, it is more effective, and it uses far less fuel. There was one more thing the temperature readings revealed, and it is perhaps the most quietly remarkable detail in the entire story. When Edna woke on the morning of the third day, after banking the stove at approximately midnight, she took a floor-level temperature reading before adding any new wood. The stove had been damped down for roughly 6 hours. No active combustion, no fresh heat input. The floor-level temperature read 44 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove had been cold for 6 hours, in a storm that was simultaneously holding the exterior at minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the interior had dropped only 4 degrees from its lowest overnight reading. That is thermal inertia. That is mass and layering and stillness doing the work that fuel alone cannot do. The system was not just heating the space. It was holding the heat, releasing it back slowly across the hours when the fire slept, the way a stone hearth holds the warmth of an afternoon fire long into the cold of a winter midnight. It was the same principle her grandmother's smokehouse had demonstrated in a different way. The same principle the military engineers had relied on in the Aleutians. The same principle that passive house designers now formalize in equations and energy models. Edna Callaway wrote none of it down as physics. She wrote only the numbers in her farm notebook next to entries about cordwood consumption and cattle feed. But the numbers told the story perfectly. There's a word that gets attached to stories like Edna Callaway's with uncomfortable frequency. People hear about a small stove holding 83 degrees of separation against a Montana blizzard, and they reach for the word miracle. It is the wrong word. It is, in fact, the most dangerous word you can apply to a story like this, because miracle implies luck, implies exception, implies that what happened was unrepeatable and inexplicable and therefore useless to anyone who wasn't Edna Callaway in that barn in that specific January. What happened in that barn was not a miracle. It was physics. Documented, predictable, replicable physics. The same physics that governs every heated space on Earth, operating under conditions that have been deliberately optimized, layer by layer, over 4 years of careful refinement. To understand it fully, you need to understand 3 separate mechanisms that were working simultaneously inside that setup. Each one is simple. Together, they were extraordinarily effective. The first mechanism was conductive heat loss reduction. Conduction is the process by which heat moves through solid material, from a warm interior wall surface, through the wall itself, to the cold exterior surface, and out into the cold air beyond. The rate at which this happens depends on 2 things: the temperature differential between inside and outside, and the thermal resistance of the material between them. Thermal resistance is what insulation provides. The more resistant the barrier, the slower the heat moves through it. Edna's system had 3 conductive barriers in series between the warm interior of the Quonset and the cold exterior air. First, the corrugated steel of the Quonset skin, low resistance on its own, but paired with the stagnant air layer trapped in its corrugated ridges, which added modest resistance. Second, the 4-foot dead air space between the Quonset and the barn wall. Dead air, still and unmoving, is one of the most effective insulating media available, with a thermal resistance comparable to low-density fiberglass bats at equivalent thickness. Third, the double-plank pine walls of the barn itself, with their own internal straw and air cavity. 3 barriers, 3 reductions. The cold that arrived at the Quonset-style skin was a fraction of the cold that hit the barn's exterior. The second mechanism was convective heat loss elimination. Convection, the movement of heat carried by moving air, is typically the dominant mode of heat loss in any building during a windstorm. Cold air infiltrates through gaps, displaces warm interior air, and carries that warmth out with it as it escapes. This mode of loss responds exponentially to wind speed. A 60-mile-per-hour wind does not create 6 times the convective loss of a 10-mile-per-hour wind. It creates something closer to 15 to 20 times the loss, because the pressure differential driving infiltration scales with wind velocity in a nonlinear relationship. The barn eliminated this mechanism almost entirely. Its walls were not perfectly sealed, but the volume of the barn was large enough and the leakage points distributed enough that the barn interior experienced only a gentle, slow air exchange. Nothing remotely resembling the aggressive infiltration driving heat loss in the exposed farmhouses on that road. And the Quonset inside the barn had its own steel skin as a second infiltration barrier, with the only intentional opening being the controlled low vent that Edna managed by hand. No wind reached the inside of that Quonset. None. The most destructive heat loss mechanism in a Montana blizzard was simply absent from the equation. The third mechanism was radiant heat redistribution by the arch. Radiant heat is electromagnetic energy, infrared radiation emitted by any warm surface, traveling in straight lines until it strikes another surface and is absorbed. A flat wall reflects some radiant heat back into the room and absorbs the rest. But the geometry of a flat-walled room means that radiant heat from a central stove strikes the walls at varying angles, with significant energy lost into corners and absorbed by surfaces far from the occupants. The interior arc of the Quonset behaved differently. The curved surface, rising from floor level at the walls and meeting at the crown, created a geometry in which radiant heat from the centrally positioned stove struck the curved interior at angles that redirected much of it back toward the center of the room, toward the occupants, toward the floor, toward the lower air mass where people actually lived. Combined with the convective loop already described in an earlier chapter, warm air rising at center, circulating down along the walls, returning to the heat source. The arch was performing a continuous, passive redistribution of every BTU the stove produced. None of these mechanisms required electricity. None required advanced materials. None required engineering drawings or building permits or professional installation. They required understanding, or in Edna's case, intuition refined by experience, of how heat moves, where it goes when you don't manage it, and how simple geometry and layering can keep it where you need it. A modern passive house architect, reviewing Edna's setup with contemporary energy modeling software, would recognize every element. The double shell envelope, the dead air cavity, the wind elimination strategy, the convective management through ceiling geometry. These are not primitive approximations of modern techniques. They're the same techniques, arrived at through different means, validated by the same physical laws. The storm outside didn't care about the difference. The temperature inside the Quonset didn't lie. The wind began to ease on the afternoon of the third day. It did not stop cleanly. Montana storms rarely do. The gusts continued through the evening, irregular, diminishing, like the last arguments of something that had spent itself, before the air went genuinely still somewhere around 2 in the morning on the fourth day. By dawn, the sky had cleared to a hard, brittle blue, and the sun came up over a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. Drifts 6 and 8 feet high against every windward wall. The county road somewhere beneath 4 feet of compacted snow. Trees along the creek line bent and frosted into shapes they had not grown into. The silence after a storm like that is a specific kind of silence. Not peaceful, assessing. Edna came out of the barn at first light to check on the cattle and take stock of her property. The barn roof had held. The Quonset had not shifted by so much as an inch. Her wood supply, stacked inside against the north wall, had sufficient split pine remaining for another 4 or 5 days at the burn rate she had maintained, perhaps 8 to 10 days at a reduced overnight rate. She had not come close to running short. The first neighbor appeared around 8 in the morning. It was Roy Dexter, the same man who had told her 3 years earlier that her stove was too small. He came on foot across the field from the east, following the line of fence posts that were still visible above the drifts, wearing every layer of clothing he appeared to own. His face, when he reached the barn door, was the face of a man who had not slept properly in 3 days and who had spent those days doing things that had not worked. He did not say much at first. He asked if she was all right. She said she was. He looked at the barn, at the small flue pipe emerging from the roof, at the amber light still visible through the gap under the barn door, and he stood there for a moment in a way that Edna later described, in the extension worker's account, as a man trying to find the right words for something he didn't fully understand yet. She invited him inside. He stepped in the barn, and then through the low door of the Quonset, and stopped. The interior was 56 degrees Fahrenheit. He had come from a farmhouse that had spent the last 36 hours hovering between 24 and 30 degrees on the main floor, where his family had been sleeping in coats beside a fireplace running at full capacity. He stood in Edna's small curved space, with its steady warmth and its smell of pine smoke and its single kerosene lamp glowing amber on the wooden shelf she had mounted to the Quonset's inner wall, and he did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "How?" She handed him a cup of coffee, kept warm on the stovetop, and began to explain. Over the next several hours, more people came. A family of 4 from the farmhouse to the east, whose main floor had finally dropped below 20 degrees by the 3rd morning despite everything they had done. An elderly couple from a small homestead a quarter-mile down the road, whose pipes had frozen through and who had no reliable heat source remaining. 2 men from farther out who had heard, through the slowly reconstituting chain of neighbor-to-neighbor communication that functions in rural communities the way radio functions in cities, that Edna Calloway's barn was warm. By midday, there were 11 people inside and around the Quonset. The barn itself, no longer fighting a 60-mile-per-hour wind, with the storm broken, was holding at a temperature somewhere around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which felt, after what the previous 3 days had delivered, almost mild. Inside the Quonset, the stove was running a little harder than Edna's usual steady pace, pushed by the additional body heat demand of 11 people in a space designed for one. The interior temperature climbed to 62 degrees by early afternoon. Nobody laughed about the tin can. Nobody mentioned surplus warm metal. Nobody asked why she had built it the way she had, in the way of people who are asking because they find the answer obvious in hindsight. They asked because they genuinely wanted to understand something they had not understood before. Edna answered every question patiently and without drama. She showed them the vent. She explained the dead air space. She described the stove's burn rate and the wood consumption across the 3 days. She walked them around the outside of the Quonset and pointed to the gap between the steel skin and the barn wall and explained what that gap was doing thermally. She showed them her notebook with the temperature readings. One of the men, a practical, no-nonsense farmer who had always prided himself on building things correctly, looked at the notebook entries for a long time. The outside temperature column, the inside temperature column, the wood-consumed column. He looked at those numbers, and then he looked at Edna, and he said something that the extension worker recorded verbatim in his 1958 report. He said, "I've been building wrong my whole life." She did not disagree with him, but she also did not pile on. She refilled his coffee and moved on to the next question, because that was her way, and because there was still a lot of work to do before the road cleared and life returned to something like normal. The barn served as an informal community shelter for 2 more days, until the county plow reached that stretch of road and families could return to their own homes to begin repairs. Edna kept the stove running, kept the coffee on, and kept answering questions. She never once said, "I told you so." She didn't have to. In the spring of 1958, a county agricultural extension worker named Gerald Marsh drove out to Edna Calloway's property to document her heating setup as part of a regional survey on cold weather farm management practices. He had heard about the blizzard and about what had happened in her barn from 3 separate sources before he thought to make the visit official. What he found, and what he wrote up in a 12-page internal report that circulated quietly among extension offices across northern Montana and never made it into any formal publication, was a description of a vernacular engineering solution that anticipated, in practice without terminology, principles that the formal building science world would not begin articulating in widely distributed literature until the late 1970s and early 1980s. The double shell envelope. The concept of treating a building's thermal performance not as a function of a single wall assembly, but as a nested series of barriers, each one reducing the severity of the thermal challenge facing the next. This principle, formalized by architect Lee Porter Butler in the late 1970s and subsequently developed into the double-envelope passive solar house designs that attracted significant research attention in the early 1980s, is exactly what Edna had built. Not as a solar house, not with any of the glazing and airflow management that formal double-envelope designs use, but as a thermal shell within a thermal shell, with dead airspace between them and a small heat source at the center. The passive house movement, which emerged from German building science research in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and which has since become the most rigorous energy efficiency building standard in the world, is built on the same foundational logic. Reduce heat loss through the building envelope so aggressively that a small, continuous heat source can maintain comfortable interior temperatures. Eliminate infiltration. Use thermal mass to flatten temperature swings. Design geometry to support natural convective circulation. Passive house certified buildings today routinely achieve interior to exterior temperature differentials of 70 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, while consuming 80 to 90% less heating energy than standard construction. Edna achieved a differential of 83 degrees Fahrenheit on the second morning of a blizzard in 1957, burning 12 pounds of pine per 8-hour overnight period in a corrugated steel military surplus structure inside an old wooden barn. The numbers are not identical. The conditions are not perfectly controlled. The comparison is not meant to suggest equivalence between vernacular frontier construction and engineered passive house design. But the principle, the underlying insight about how heat behaves and where it goes, and how layering and geometry and stillness can be used to keep it where you need it, is the same principle arrived at by a woman alone on a Montana plain with surplus war materials and 4 winters of careful observation. Gerald Marsh's report noted, with a restraint that reads almost like understatement, that Mrs. Calloway's installation represented a practical application of thermal layering principles not commonly observed in residential farm construction of the period, and that the efficiency demonstrated during the January 1957 weather event suggests potential value in wider dissemination of similar approaches. The report was filed. It circulated. It did not change the way people in Toole County built their houses. Edna lived in her Quonset inside her barn until 1971, when she sold the property and moved to a smaller house in town. The barn still stood when Gerald Marsh revisited the property in 1974 to photograph it for a follow-up memo that also never made it into formal publication. The Quonset was still there. The stove was still there. The vent plate was still operational. The hay bales along the walls had been replaced by whoever had taken over the property, but the structure itself, the steel arch, the 4-foot dead air space, the nested geometry, was intact and functional. The new owner, Marsh noted, was using it to store feed. That detail, the double-envelope thermal refuge repurposed as a feed storage shed, is perhaps the most honest summary of the relationship between practical ingenuity and institutional memory. The knowledge that built it had not been written down in any place where it could survive the transfer of ownership. It had lived in Edna's hands and in her notebook and in the memories of 11 people who had spent 2 cold days inside her barn. When she left, much of it went with her. What we were left with is the principle, the physical reality that nested shells of still air, managed geometry, and a modest heat source can maintain survivable warmth against conditions that defeat more powerful but less intelligent systems. That the right question to ask is not how much heat can I produce, but how much heat can I keep from leaving? That a curved ceiling is not an aesthetic choice, but an engineering decision. That a barn full of hay and cattle is not just a farm building, but a thermal reservoir. These are not complicated ideas. They do not require engineering degrees or expensive materials or professional certification. They require the same thing they required in 1953 when a woman alone on a 40-acre parcel outside of Shelby, Montana, looked at a surplus military hut and understood, intuitively, practically correctly, that the most powerful thing she could build was not a bigger stove. It was a better shell, and the shell she built held against the worst blizzard in a generation, while the bigger stoves around her burned through their wood and still went cold. The physics hasn't changed. The lesson hasn't either. This content is educational and historical in nature. It does not substitute for professional engineering or safety standards.